7:31. No, I've put it to wave around. Okay. Yep, ready when you are.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, nau mai, haere mai, ko Jennifer Curtin toko ingoa, ke te waikato e whakatipu au, no kirikiri roa aho. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the Public Policy Institute, welcome to the University of Auckland for a conversation about what the Sustainable Development Goals mean for New Zealand. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. It provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. And it's underpinned by 17 ambitious and wide-ranging sustainable development goals. It calls on developed and developing countries to work in a global partnership to end poverty, reduce disparities in health, education, gender gaps, and broader inequalities in work and income, as well as specific attention to a range of environmental issues, built and natural, with the latter focused on water, energy, climate change, and the preservation of non-human animal life and habitats. All of this while maintaining economic growth. It's like a global strategic plan, and it feels like it has harnessed a real sense of urgency amongst people and cities. And who better to talk with us about the significance of these goals but our eminent guest, the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Helen's career includes time as a political activist on international issues, a politician for 27 years, a 3-term Prime Minister, and administrator of the UN Development Programme for 2 terms. But since leaving that role, Helen has continued to be a global champion of many critical issues related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Please join me in welcoming Helen Clark. So, before we get into what's possible with the SDGs, let's take a step back. Your government was elected in 1999 and the Millennium Development Goals were agreed to in 2000. So can you talk to us a little bit about where we got to with those in New Zealand and globally?
Well, firstly, good evening everyone, and thank you to Jennifer and the Public Policy Institute and the University for making the conversation possible tonight and repeat it tomorrow night in Whangarei as well. So yes, September 2000 was one of those big years at the UN with the Millennium Summit. And not everyone here may recall the ushering in of the new millennium, but apart from worrying about what the Y2 bug might do to everything that was digitised, actually the start of the new millennium was really quite a time of hope. You know, people think, well, maybe this one can be better than the last, which you would think wouldn't be difficult, but actually it is. Kofi Annan, as Secretary General of the UN, organised this big summit, the Millennium Summit in New York. And as a young Prime Minister, I went off to the Millennium Summit. And when you're preparing for these summits, the Foreign Ministry always says, oh, well, there's this to sign and that to sign. And I say, what's this? And they say, the Millennium Declaration. I say, well, is it good? Oh, yes, good to sign, you know, great. So sign the Millennium Declaration, which sounds a bit like that Sustainable Development Goal set of aspirations you just read out. And in the Millennium Declaration, there were these areas which are signalled as things that should have action on them. in the new millennium. But after the Millennium Summit, one of my predecessors as head of UNDP, Mark Malloch-Brown, later Lord Malloch-Brown and a Minister of State at the Foreign Office in the UK, he was asked by Kofi Annan to go away and turn these into goals with targets, which he did. And so strictly speaking, the Millennium Development Goals were not issued with the declaration, but they flowed out of it. However, the fact that they flowed out of it and hadn't actually been negotiated to the nth degree by member states meant that there was always a body of member states that said these are not internationally agreed goals. Even though they'd agreed the declaration and the broad areas, they never quite accepted them as internationally agreed goals. And that probably accounts a little, you know, the process of getting to them, for them not getting traction fast. When I went to UNDP, there was clearly a long way to go on a lot of these goals, and I challenged the organisation to produce work on what would it take to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And that was quite useful and led to a number of efforts to accelerate action. But actually already in the health area, some very significant things had happened. Millennium Development Goals 8 in nature, put one aside, that was the only one that asked developed countries to do anything, and that said international partnerships and solidarity and the 0.7% of gross national income on development assistance, which we and most other developed countries have never met. The other 7 things were all things that developing countries should achieve, and 3 of those goals were in the health area. One was on child health, well-being, mortality, another on women's health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, maternal mortality, and then the other was on 3 specified diseases, HIV, malaria and TB. Now, there has been work done in the Global Burden of Disease study, which looks at the trends in those areas before the MDGs and the target setting and the mobilisation of solidarity around those goals, and after. And that study certainly indicates that we got more traction on and progress in those areas than would have been the case without the focus of the MDGs. And particularly for HIV, malaria, TB, one of the responses was the Global Fund to fight those 3 diseases, which exists to this day, and it just appears to have had quite a successful recapitalisation again. At the time of the Millennium Development Goals being launched, there would have been the tiniest number of people in developing countries on antiretrovirals, for example, for HIV. Now, you know, with the international solidarity from countries and big foundations like Gates, there's been a lot of progress in that area. Similarly on malaria, and of course if you target malaria, then you're also going to target children's health, because malaria has been such a significant cause of mortality and stunting of children and so on. So anyway, there was progress in those 3 health areas, quite significant. The targets weren't met for reduction of maternal mortality, but nonetheless there was progress, quite good progress on children's health. Education, the Millennium Development Goals said every child in school, and that meant primary schooling. And, you know, it got pretty close, but the quality couldn't keep up with it. And when you look at the international surveys now, and one of the things I do with my life currently is chair UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, which looks at progress on things. They, for years, have been reporting that children with even 5-6 years of primary education in a lot of countries are still functionally illiterate and innumerate. Right? Not much has been learned, because there's so much pressure, obviously, to get children in front of a teacher, but the teacher hasn't had the opportunity to train, doesn't have curriculum material. If it's in a shed and not the kind of classroom that we would be familiar with here, none of this helps. So education, yes, progress, but. Now on poverty, often the UN publications would say, you know, tremendous progress on poverty reduction. Well, I have to say, the great bulk of it was in China, because China determined that it was going to lift its people out of poverty. And when you lift 600 million people out of extreme poverty, that affects global figures. But the truth was there were regions of the world where it really didn't drop too much at all. On hunger, there was some progress, but that started to tail off. And when you ask me what's happening with the SDGs, we're in quite significant issues now globally with hunger. So that's kind of a snapshot. Of course, there was also a gender equality goal, and as we know, even in our own country, it's a bit patchy, isn't it? We make progress in a lot of areas, but we look at the high rate of domestic and family violence, sexual and gender-based violence, and we know we're not there yet. We still have a pay gap, nowhere near as large as many countries, but nonetheless something around the 9.3% mark. So, all in all, the Millennium Development Goals ended up being quite a good effort, and they did get traction by the end, and they certainly created an appetite for a new era of goals, and this will lead you, I'm sure, into the next question, but developing countries wanted goals where developed countries had to front up as well. They said, we're on the receiving end of a lot of the issues that you folks have caused, and you have to be an active part of the solution. And so the new goals led to a universal agenda applicable from Somalia to New Zealand and beyond, and a very ambitious agenda, but one it's the right agenda, it's the right direction. It's rather complicated, but if it was honestly attempted by everyone, the world will be a better place.
So we have the blueprint. And
green print, I suppose we should say.
Yeah, maybe. And we have the 169 targets for the 17 goals. So, and some of them are quite, quite explicit. By 2030, X, Y, and Z will take place. Others are sort of more aspirational statements. So if you go to the gender equality targets, it's like eliminate all discrimination against women with no target date. But the targets are necessary, because that's how, you tie a strategic plan to targets. The bit in the middle that seems to be missing, you've alluded to international solidarity and developing countries wanting these to, harness the goodwill and the power of the developed world. But I'm just wondering if implementation, which is still down to domestic governments, national governments, it's not something that can happen globally to the same extent. Is that the missing piece, and how do you get governments to actually make the connections and do the work of implementing in order to reach these targets?
Well, there's many, many layers to how one could answer that. Developing countries in general are very positive about the agenda. And in the last couple of years I was at UNDP as we were preparing for implementation, because basically the shape of this agenda was pretty clear by the time you went into 2015. We started leading exercises at the request of developing country governments as to how to mainstream these sustainable development goals into their development plans, because unlike Western countries, developing countries, almost to a country, do have a national development plan. We had our last one with Mr. Muldoon, I think, and planning got a very bad name in the West, that it was somehow not consistent with the market economy. Well, of course, if you don't plan, there is a problem. You don't have to do the old controlled central planning, but you do need strategies and targets and so on. So developing countries still with that tradition of planning had something to latch on to. And bear in mind that this isn't the only global agenda which was coming at countries. You also had the Paris Climate Agreement. And what is very difficult for developing countries is if they're told, well, you've got to report on SDGs, and you've got to report on climate, and you've got to report on this and that. You need to mainstream these agendas into the National Development Plan. So we spent quite a lot of time working on that with countries. How would you do an SDG assessment? How would you assess your climate action readiness? What would need to be done and incorporate it into the planning? So there's been a lot of goodwill around that. Now, some Western countries do have an explicit SDG strategy. One of them is Germany, And a couple of years ago, I was asked to lead the international panel, which they ask every few years to review their strategy and progress, so I'm quite familiar with it. And Germany took the SDGs, it singled where it had the most challenges, and frankly they were in agriculture and transport and energy, and in the health area and obesity, social inclusion emerging as an issue with the increasing diversity of the population. But they then set targets consistent with the SDGs and have a very clear strategy. New Zealand doesn't as yet have a specific SDG strategy. It has other things going on which are consistent with it, but to really be able to measure how you were doing, you'd need to be more particular, I think, in terms of saying, well, here is the SDG strategy and this is what we're going after. So coming to the part of your question where you say, well, isn't it up to national governments? Yes and no. In the least developed countries, there really isn't any prospect of making progress without international solidarity. That is the reality. And if you look at some of the trends now, on, for example, poverty, the goal is to eradicate poverty by 2030. Almost as soon as the ink was dry on that, the World Bank was forecasting, well, that will be eradication minus 3%. Well, not good if you're in the 3%. But the studies now coming through are talking about missing it by 6%. And with the size of the world population, that can be as many as 475 million people who would be left in that under $1.91 a day subsistence rate. Then you have the hunger figures, and each of the last 3 years, the World Food Programme has been predicting, well, not predicting, it has actually been reporting an increase in the absolute numbers of hungry people. And this, again, is not unrelated to climate, right? There's more recurrent and extreme drought in the drought-prone areas. There's more dramatic flooding and other events which affect food supply. There's a lot of conflicts which stop people getting the food and nutrition that they need. So the last count WFP put out had over 821 million people who go to bed hungry every night, and that's a significant number of the world's 7.5 billion people. On education, the target is that by 2030, every 6 to 17-year-old will be in school, right? So it goes beyond the primary schooling to the secondary schooling. The latest UNESCO report that's come out suggests that on current trends, 1 in 6 children would not meet that, and that's quite significant again. So the goals are in some trouble, and clearly where they're in the most trouble on those basic indicators of what we might call multi-dimensional poverty, they are in the poorest countries, and they need help. On the projections of economic growth that we have, they're not going to be able to pull people out of that extreme poverty and be able to budget to meet the education and health needs. So there will be an ongoing need for those development assistance budgets and doing whatever we can to support people in those countries.
So, talking about countries, and it's sort of reification really, like as if there are no people inside countries making political decisions about what to spend and who to spend it on. I'm wondering though then, given that in this implementation space, do we also need, in addition to the goals and the targets, policy entrepreneurs or champions or individuals who can take the lead and be brave and do the developed work? Do you feel that the politicians in the developed world are brave enough to do this work on behalf of the developing world?
Well, I mean, it is a very challenging agenda, and it's a challenging agenda in this country because it's requiring countries to plan holistically across the economic, social and environmental areas. And that means business as usual for countries like ours, but for all countries, is just not going to cut it. You know, if the rest of the world developed the way we have developed, well, I mean, isn't that why the Amazon's on fire? You know, we cleared 2/3 plus of our forests. We damaged 90% of our wetlands, you know. Now, it's so critical to hang on to what is there now in the lungs of the planet, in the Amazon, in the Congo Basin, in Borneo and West Papua and Papua New Guinea. But it's not easy. There's a lot of development pressures. And so you need to be looking at what mechanisms might stop that. And, you know, not that many countries have stepped up big time to support the forest countries by putting a value on the forest standing that is bigger than the value of clearing it, and let's say a very short-term value of clearing it for other purposes. Because actually what the Brazilian president would find, if he's around long enough, is that having destroyed the Amazon, he will have, you know, not only fundamentally, you know, wrecked the world's climate system, but he will have wrecked a lot of things about Brazil and its ability to produce sustainably as well. But they're very, very complicated questions. For developing countries, one of the key areas of support is to support the governance capacity to be able to plan strategically and get the policies and laws in place to do a lot of things that need to be done. You know, we tend to take a bit for granted that, you know, if you have a bureaucracy, it will, you know, provide information that will be adequate for planning purposes, and, you know, you can get on and design a policy and you have the capacity to implement it. At least that used to be the case. But that can't be taken for granted in many places. So you need champions. You know, the best champion is always the one at the top who whips the ministerial team into line and bureaucracy and says, that's the way we're going, you know, let's get on with it. But you need champions at every level. Now, I think the university role is quite important, and, you know, full marks to Auckland University, which is being very well rated on sustainable development goals, I see, globally, rated best in the world for overall impact that it's having, which is great. You need civil society champions, and because I brought along a lot of literature to show people that there is an industry out there that's writing reports. So here's a part of the industry, and this is the People's Report on the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals that's been brought together by the NGO consortium here. Jill Greer and others led the writing of it, and it's a good report. You know, it says, here's what this means for New Zealand. So you've got some real champions there who, you know, and civil society has to keep government to account, by the way. This is one of the things when we were at UNDP, we urged around the world, don't let your governments off the hook. They all went to New York and signed these goals. Well, make sure they do something about them. So this is the NGO effort from New Zealand to do that. So you've got the role of the universities, you've got the role of science and research generally, to get the facts out there, to support evidence-based policy making. You've got civil society role. And then there's the private sector, because how business does business has a huge impact on whether you can achieve any of the things in the SDGs. You know, is business going to be a willing partner in sustainable development? Is it going to incorporate the sustainable development goals into the way it does business? You know, there are businesses here that think this way. There are many businesses globally that think this way, but not enough yet. And one of the jobs of the Global Compact, which was set up by Kofi Annan to be the interface between the UN and the private sector, and companies can join if they sign up to the 10 principles, was to make sure that there were, you know, significant elements of the business community who were plugged into the global agendas and could help advance them in the economy.
So the champions have to come from everywhere. Quite a bit of the focus inside New Zealand, just pulling it away from the developing and into New Zealand momentarily, there's a strong focus on cities inside, and the importance of local urban initiatives to meet the goals. Do you think this is a different approach, and what happens when you live in a country where funding for almost everything sits at the central government level and there's not a lot of resource for cities or for regional areas through the local government structure that we have, because we're not a federal system, so we don't sort of have those lovely tools like fiscal equalisation arrangements that we see in Australia and so on, where GST is shared and those sorts of things. Do you think the sort of less powerful elements related to local government is going to make it difficult to advance, sustainable cities?
Well, for the past 12 years or so, ever since New Zealand hosted the Commonwealth Local Government Forums Conference, I've been one of their patrons, and probably their most active one. And the Commonwealth Local Government Forum plays a role in really jollying local governments around the Commonwealth into picking up the global agendas and running with them. It did a lot with the Millennium Development Goals, and I've kept over the years addressing their conferences. And it's now very much using its every 2-year conference when it brings together mayors and local government associations and ministers to plug local government in to the latest on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm of the view that even in a system like the New Zealand one, local government can make a power of difference, really, within the powers that it has. I mean, if you take a number of the areas that are relevant in the SDGs, how transport is planned, how buildings are designed, what's the planning code, what does the Auckland Unitary Plan say? These things can all be used within a Sustainable Development Goal framework. So it would be great to see New Zealand cities pick up the Sustainable Development Goals and run with them to the extent of the capacity that they have. And I really believe in the power of urban leadership to push for inclusive and sustainable cities. There was in 2016 a kind of complementary conference to the Sustainable Development Goal one, which was the Habitat 3, and it produced the new urban agenda. And in a sense, that takes the Sustainable Development objectives and puts them into the urban setting and calls for the development of safe, inclusive, resilient and sustainable cities. Well, every city, every local government can contribute to that.
So the word sustainability, thinking about cities for a bit longer, often gets put with environmental and economic sustainability, but sometimes there's questions raised about what that means for the social or equity dimensions of sustainability. So for example, greening cities or development projects to make inner cities more livable and lovely can often lead to gentrification. And this then marginalises the already marginalised, and they get pushed out of the cities in which they've been, or the inner cities in which they've been living. So how do we get around this need to balance social or equitable sustainability with environmental strategies for cities?
Well, again, if we take the whole Sustainable Development Framework, one of the goals, number 10, is the one on significantly reducing inequalities. And so if you have that in your mind as a good objective, your planning at the city level should be around social cohesion and inclusion. And that would lead you, for example, to be thinking about housing and how you zone. And do you make it possible for the lowest income people to have affordable housing within areas that traditionally inhabited by low income people? I mean, interestingly, you think of Freeman's Bay, which was the Wharfies area of Auckland, and today is the $2 million home. I guess what wasn't bowled over in the 50s with urban regeneration. But again, in a country like New Zealand, this is an issue that goes also beyond the local government. I mean, we've ended up with a serious marginalisation and poverty set of problems. A lot of it's related to the cost of housing, and I think government and at the central level and local government need to be very consciously planning for that, as I think they're trying to do. But the problem is deep, and progress isn't always as rapid as people would like.
So, thinking about the New Zealand public, do you think there's a broad understanding of the significance of the SDGs, and what should we be doing, given we're sitting inside a university, to do more education, not just of our young people, but everyone, to think more globally and holistically and internationally about the SDGs and sustainability? You
see, I think if you went out down Parangahape Road and stopped people and said, do you know about the Sustainable Development Goals? Maybe 5 in 100 would say, oh yeah, that's something to do with the UN, isn't it? Not about us. So I actually think the level of public awareness is quite low. Whereas probably there's a bit more awareness of the wellbeing budget because it's had a lot of publicity. And as I say, it's not inconsistent with where the SDGs go, but it's not framed as such. On the other hand, set the terminology aside, I think New Zealanders have traditionally had sort of an idealised self-image which says, we're a country where, anyone can succeed and we care about the environment and so on. But actually we've got a lot of work to do to make that idealised version of ourselves a credible one in the 21st century. But do I think people care about those things? Yes, they do. I think they do care about the biodiversity. They worry that something like 80% of our bird species are threatened with or near extinction. They do worry about these things when they're drawn to their attention. I think people do worry about gross poverty. Who can really celebrate a family sleeping in a car in our city? We don't like it at all. We think this is wrong. So I think New Zealanders are in the market for solutions to these problems, and if it's presented as a coherent, this is the country we want to be, I don't think you'll get public resistance. Now, having said that, it's one thing to have the high level of aspiration, and then it's another to get people to accept what has to be done to make that possible. And I sometimes recall a survey done at the time when I was Prime Minister, which asked, should the government be doing something about climate change? Yes, 80+% of people said, yes, the government should do something, because we all think the government should do something in New Zealand. And then the question line went on, and it gets to the point of, well, would you be prepared to pay more for a litre of petrol? Well, the support for that was rather low. Now, maybe attitudes have changed in the last 10, 15 years or so. I hope so, although I fear not. So, yeah, people, I think the key thing with the very challenging policy issues, not only New Zealand faces, but everyone faces now, is be upfront with the public. Take them into your confidence about what you see the challenges as being, because they're significant. And if you're going to change doing business as usual, then you need to, create an understanding of why that is necessary, the kinds of options that there are. And the other thing is, bring the public into the discussion and the solution design. We do have active civil society here, but sometimes, probably quite often, civil society feels it has its nose pressed to the glass and quite can't get into close to decision makers. So I think we have to bear in mind being inclusive in the way we define the problems and design the solutions is very important.
So we have an active civil society, and it's quite, we've got a lot of freedom of speech arrangements here, but so one of the SDGs speaks about peace, justice and strong institutions, and we hear a lot in the media and other places about declining trust in our institutions. our public institutions in particular. So how do we create more robust and inclusive ways of doing things given the rise of the right-wing styled populist parties globally that are actually, in a way, trying to wedge that decline of trust, or a narrative of declining trust in institutions and elites and science? How do we balance those two impulses, if you like?
Well, one of the problems with populism is it erodes the mechanisms and processes by which it came to power. Right? It tends to sort of turn back in and attack civil society, media, NGOs, and so on. I was on a panel at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg a couple of years ago on is populism a bad thing? And one of the points I made was that it does corrode, it does undermine the institutions through which it was able to come to power. On the trust issue, there's some quite interesting research on this. I mean, in the West, we report that there's a loss of trust in institutions and media and so on. But if you ask the same questions in authoritarian countries, people say, oh yes, we trust our government. Well, how could they not say they trust their government? So I'm a little bit sceptical about the trust thing. I mean, I think people should be sceptical. They should be asking questions. That's the media's role. But also encourage a participation that gives people agency and power. That's important. Now, Sustainable Development Goal 16 on building inclusive and peaceful societies is a very, very tough goal. It was a goal that, by and large, the G77, the group of 77 at the UN, which is developing countries, did not want because they felt that the West would be lecturing on democracy. On the other hand, the Western group, Western Europe and others, of which we're part, they wanted it because, and it's reasonable to say so, the quality of governance actually does have a bearing on whether you achieve any goal at all. And if government is inclusive and responsive, it's more likely, to be responding to people's needs and these kinds of issues than if it's not accountable at all. So in the end, the trade-off was the West got SDG 16, and then we also got the other 16 goals, which is rather too many, 169 targets and 232 indicators and still counting. So it's a bit of a soup. But I follow very closely what is happening around the world to the ability of people to speak out and voice their opinion. And there are some very, very disturbing trends where a lot of countries could not make any credible report on SDG 16. In the Commonwealth, which of course has the Harare principles and agreements and promotes good governance, we have some pretty worrying issues at the current time. Take, for example, Uganda, where a young popular musician has emerged. His stage name is Bobby Wine. If you go on Twitter, hashtag Bobby Wine. And a popular musician has come out of the informal settlements, and he's challenging the president. Well, for his pains, late last year, he was arrested, taken into detention. Well, let's not put too fine a point on it. He was tortured. He appeared in court, just completely broken. And in the end, somehow friends managed to get him out of the country for medical treatment. But he's back and under severe pressure. And there's a lot of countries where you take your life into your hands when you stand up to ask for political change. In Tanzania, there are a number of disturbing developments. And if I just instance those with journalists, there are 2 journalists at the moment who've been arrested and detained and charged on quite spurious things, one of them writing for The Economist. But this is not good, but one could go on. You could take the election in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the person who came third was declared the winner. And independent observers say 1. He didn't like it, but the West pronounced that it was happy with the results. So, yeah, there we are. And when you say to people, well, why was this accepted? They say, oh, well, there wasn't any violence. That must have been a successful election. Well, there only wasn't any violence because the lead opposition candidate didn't take the road of calling people out onto the streets. You know, some of you will be watching what's happening in Zimbabwe. I mean, I could go on, but this is a very, very challenging goal. And let me not just limit my comments to Africa. I mean, Central Asia for the most part isn't the beacon of liberty and tolerance. You've just had a election in recent months under a constitution imposed by the Thai military in Thailand, where they say who can run and who can't, and cheerfully invalidate parties associated with the last democratically elected government. So, yeah, it's very difficult out there at the moment. And, I do think that for the SDGs to become reality, you need to have these inclusive, responsive, representative, peaceful societies. But many countries don't enjoy them.
So that leads me to my last formal question, which maybe you've kind of already answered it, which is what's your prediction on the likely degree of success in achieving these goals, and what else is needed?
Well, at the UN General Assembly High-Level Week at the end of September, and every year there's a high-level week and leaders come from around the world to go to it, and actually more go than ever used to. That's the way of the world. I was only ever advised by Foreign Affairs to go once, but that wouldn't be credible now. People expect prime ministers and heads of government to do. So they have 5 different high-level summits, and one of them is specifically on sustainable development goals. There's another on climate, a third on universal healthcare, one on the Samoa pathway, which is the agenda for the small island developing states, and then there's one on financing for development as well. But it would be nice if out of that summit on the SDGs there was a wake-up call that said we're going to miss these by a country mile unless everyone takes them more seriously. And that means all countries, but it also does mean a message to the OECD countries, who are the official development assistance donors, that they need to step up if there's to be any prospect of the poverty, hunger, basic health, education, water goals being achieved. And then on the climate action, which is just so linked with whether the SDGs can be achieved, we're so way short of the commitments that are needed on that. When Secretary General Guterres spoke at the Climate Change Conference in Poland late last year, he made the comment that we're about 80% short of the level of commitment you would need to meet the not going over the 1.5 degree threshold. Now, that's a lot to make up. The truth is we're probably careering towards a 3 to 4 degree global warming scenario, and that is disastrous. So what developing countries are screaming is they need support for adaptation now for what's happening to their ability to produce food, to safeguard their infrastructure, design to new standards of resilience for the superstorms and so on. And yet the public funding coming in for climate action hasn't been anything like what was promised either. So at the present level of commitment, you couldn't meet any of these agendas. The question is whether the world is just going to kind of move on like that and say, oh, well, that was then, this is now. The reality is also that if you tried to negotiate the Paris Agreement and the SDGs in the current geopolitical context, you could not do it. You could not do it with what's happened in Washington, D.C. or Brasilia. Brazil hosted the Sustainable Development Summit, which was Rio +20, out of which the direction to develop the SDGs came. Well, when a country that important is then missing in action, you can see how devastating that is. So 2015 was a particular window of time which allowed very good agendas to be developed, but there's now been slippage in the political climate and tolerance for that. And it's going to need a lot of effort. And in a lot of countries, it's got to come from the bottom up, right? Because the governments aren't that interested or are actively hostile. So it's got to come with a big push from people.
And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to you, the audience, to ask some questions of Helen.
Way up the back.
Yep, there's a mic coming.
Because you're being live streamed, you must have a mic.
It's really interesting to hear what you have to say about the sustainability goals of how we're kind of careering away from them. There's one aspect, I think there's definitely the idea that government should be held accountable, but what do you think more about the corporations that work kind of in hand with those governments? What should we be doing as employees of those companies to kind of push the boat towards hopefully adding some value to these goals?
Yeah, my impression is, when I think back to many events I did with companies in my time in public life, that you would go to open this or that or the other, and actually what they wanted to talk to you about was what they were doing to become more sustainable. And I found that really quite encouraging. So I think that, everything that is done with the Sustainable Business Council and others who are working, and there's often annual awards which I've spoken at here in the past which acknowledge, big efforts in sustainability in companies. All this is to be encouraged. I think employees can push it. I think there can be champions within the staff, within the management. But, my feeling is a lot of the appetite for this is quite good in New Zealand in business. I mean, people like Stephen Tyndall being tremendous champions of sustainable development, going back years and years and years, and he's not alone. But certainly a push from the staff to say that, could we define the company by this? I mean, there's the broader issue too for New Zealand as an exporting and tourist attracting nation, that increasingly in the highest value markets for our products and services, there are questions about, well, how is this made? How did it get here? What was the value chain? Was it sustainable? There's quite a movement in Europe now for people not to fly anywhere. Imagine what that's going to do for tourism. There's quite a movement against intensive agriculture. What do we have? Intensive agriculture. So, I mean, these are almost existential threats to New Zealand if it sits like a possum in the headlights and doesn't address these core sustainability issues. We know we've got water quality issues. We are ranked, believe it or not, New Zealand as the 21st biggest greenhouse gas emission country in the world. There's 193 countries, and we're 21st in greenhouse gas emissions per capita. That's not good. And in the developed countries, we're 5th. Now, we all know that half our greenhouse gas emissions come off agriculture, intensive agriculture. So we have some thinking to do about how we try to get that down. Part of it may be less intensity, less going over after volume and more after value. It'll be in the way we farm. It'll be whether science has any more answers around the methane emission issue in general. How much are we using the nitrification inhibitor technology to lower the nitrous oxide emissions? But we've got quite a lot of issues. So I think that a move for sustainable farming and sustainable tourism to be not just cliches, but actually an action plan where we inspire people to see what they can do in their individual enterprise to change is very important. Here first and then come around the other side.
Kia ora, thanks very much. Helen, really enjoyed that. So one of the things that we're seeing with companies and causes organisation is, yes, the appetite to be part of the SDGs, but to cherry pick certain SDGs over others. And then, because we're not thinking systemically or holistically, having unintended consequences in others. At the same time, we're also not prioritising some of those baseline SDGs, the biosphere, the planetary boundary SDGs. So I can see, you know, although there might be, the appetite is at the right direction, and I'm just wondering on those two issues of the cherry picking and not thinking holistically, as well as creating that baseline so we can deal with the biosphere first. Do you have any thoughts on how we might approach that, either in this country or globally?
Well, the sustainable development does require a capacity for systems thinking, as it's called, to look holistically, look at how a decision here might impact there. I mean, you know, how you set the rules around fishing is going to determine whether the Maui's dolphin survives, right? Or the New Zealand sea lion, or whatever. You know, whether we, you know, allow development on undeveloped parts of our coastline may, you know, determine whether the New Zealand otter or other birds survive. So let's think very, very, very holistically about these issues. Again, I think, you know, New Zealand has the basis for action. We've had biodiversity strategies going back a long time, but they need some. They always need teeth, and they need money. We now have the zero carbon legislation, and you know the shaping of a climate action strategy which is great. We've on the sort of marine set of ocean set of goals. You know, we're yeah. I think we could do better, but we have the shape of the regulatory framework with the quota system, etc. But yeah, we have a lot of challenges in these areas of goals, and I suppose, you know, for Western countries, one of the challenges has been that when they hear, you know, development goals, they think, oh, that's those other countries. But it's us. It's about us. You know, that we and other Western countries will struggle to reach the targets in these areas, let alone the social areas that I've talked about with poverty and marginalisation. I did a check tonight as to, you know, what about hunger in New Zealand? What about food insecurity? And the Ministry of Health report out earlier this year says that 19%, that's almost 1 in 5 of our children, live in severe to moderately food insecure households. Well, that's a worry, a very significant worry. So, yeah, we've got social challenges, we've got environmental challenges, but, you know, in my opinion, none of them are insoluble. You know, where there's a will, there's a way. And we just have to have the determination that they can be tackled.
Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned how this to make sustainable development goals to happen, when to operate at a multidimensional level, also the private sector needs to participate, hopefully actively, but they are profit driven. So how could you make them actively engage in those sustainable development goals rather than just hope that we'll do it? And I think you mentioned like you can, if staff members are having those ideas, they might push the change from within the companies, but still unless they collectively push, it's probably not very likely to happen because after all, it's still profit driven. And also I was wondering, what could the government do to not only to promote those changes, but also like to actually driving those changes? Thank you.
Well, I think that, a company that has as its sole judgment or criterion of whether it's making progress, profit, it's not going to do very well. It's got to think about its place in society as well. Is it a responsible corporate citizen? Do people like this company? Do they think it's a good company? They want to know more about it. So, sometimes in New Zealand there has been a very narrow, profit-driven approach that all that matters is return to shareholders. But I believe many think more widely than that. You can think of examples of corporate leadership globally, like that of Paul Polman at Unilever, just stood down as chief executive. But he was right at the forefront of positioning Unilever as a company that cared about climate, that would not source any palm oil product from recently deforested land. It really made a stand on climate action. And it would be great to see more such champions here. I think a lot of people quietly get on with it, but to really sustain climate action as a national movement here, you need a lot of visible champions, which comes back to one of the questions that was asked. So to me, a company that cares about these things will be, seeking the views of what its staff think. What could we do? And given the challenge, staff have often got many ideas of how the company could improve its performance, how it could become more inclusive, accept value, diversity, and how it can look after its environmental outlook there. So all doable, but needs a push from top and bottom. The government has the role of legislation and regulation. So to a certain extent, it can steer things. But a lot of things we're talking about are also things that need to be driven from the company level, where the government's not going to closely prescribe that at all in a country like this.
But national procurement strategies or plans, so yes, government's decisions about what they will and won't purchase.
If you decide you're going to have green procurement, well, that will rule some people out unless they change the way they do things.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to do one last question. So down here somewhere. No? Oh, okay. Just put your hands up so Suzanne can see you, please. You.
Right on the aisle.
Hi, thank you for coming today. Earlier on, probably about 10 minutes ago, you were talking about how tourism is so important to New Zealand, and with the push in Europe to fly less, and how that would affect New Zealand as our tourism market, because Air New Zealand, for instance, has the carbon buyback scheme, which is trying to make travelling more eco-friendly. But so much of our tourism is reliant on that private sector with those airlines, and we don't have as much of influence over the other international airlines coming here. So what can the government do to try to make actually getting to New Zealand appear a more eco-friendly option than it currently is?
Well, it seems to me, and as Prime Minister, I have quite a lot to do with the tourism industry, that you've got many players, many small players, and then you've got the sort of national carrier area in New Zealand. You've got a lot of foreign-owned hotels and so on. But in my opinion, if the government is clear about the direction and objectives it has for tourism, and I would strongly advocate a value over volume strategy again, because over-tourism, cheap tourism is ruining the world's beauty spots from here right around the world. Then I think you can take the sector with you. Air New Zealand did run the first biofuel-powered flight, I think, from here up to the west coast of the States. I think they're very conscious of these issues. It may be that green hydrogen eventually will become available as a fuel for planes. I'm sure they'd jump at it to be the first of it if it does, to get away from fossil fuels. But I think a lot of thought needs to go into this issue of sustainability, because otherwise, in the high-value tourism markets we have, we may face resistance, where people say it's not socially responsible to fly that distance, and that would deal quite a blow to the New Zealand economy, given that about 1 in 12 jobs, roughly 12% of GDP or whatever, comes with tourism.
So thank you very much. We're out of time. It's after 8:30. I think we could probably sit here for another half hour at least and have these conversations. I'd just like to wrap this though and urge you all to talk to your bosses about what we should be doing, and get involved in civil society organisations as you see fit. And I'd ask you to join with me in thanking Helen Clark.